So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world today. Thank you very much for joining us today for the latest episode of the State of Digital Clinical Trials podcast. It is my absolute pleasure today to be joined by, I'll call him a stalwart of the industry, someone who has guided so many of us who hopefully are listening today, and that is Ken Getz. And it is my absolute honor to have you on the podcast today, Ken. I know we've talked a little while about making it happen, and here we are today. So welcome. And maybe I can start with just inviting you to introduce yourself in your own words to anyone who perhaps incredibly doesn't know who you are.
Oh, well, thank you. First off, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, Richard, and delighted to be conversing with you. I think I'll introduce myself by just talking about the two primary hats that I wear. One is as the executive director and a professor at the Tufts University School of Medicine, where I direct the Center for the Study of Drug Development. And the other is as the founder and chairman of the board of the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, or CISCRP, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating the public and patients about the clinical research process and how they can be a partner and engage with that process.
If I think back to how we first met, it's been perhaps what you are most well known for in some respects, which is the surveys you've done, the data you've helped generate, and the information you've helped share. Maybe I can take a second to, well, we'll come on to the research project as well, but maybe we can ask you just to reflect a little bit on how do you think clinical research has changed over the last 20, 30 or more years?
We literally could have a podcast series that might have multiple episodes, Richard, to really sort of map the changes that we've observed. And I think a lot of it has been just such great fortune for me. I sort of came into this whole world of clinical research some 35 years ago when it was just a very, very traditional environment. Most research was conducted within academic research centers. It was sort of a very, very traditional collection of pharmaceutical companies studying small molecules. And what you started to see in the late 80s and early 90s was the privatization of clinical research. It started to move away from the academic centers into private community-based investigative sites. It was a time when there was so much focus on cost containment that it sort of introduced the privatization of departments within pharma, literally the creation of outsourced services, starting really with statistics and medical writing, study monitoring, and then moving into other areas. So that was sort of the first change. And we monitored and tracked all that at CenterWatch, the publishing company that I founded. It was a remarkable time that the landscape was totally changing its structure and becoming more privatized. Then in sort of the late 90s and into the 2000s, you started to see a focus on operational feasibility and efficiency, and data collection and data management played a very large role in that period. You saw really a focus on better and more effective collaborations, better integration of disparate parties all supporting clinical research. And then the last major transition, I think, has been sort of captured by the personalized medicine and the patient engagement movement, where I think for the last 15 years or so, you've seen so much focus on delivering to patients and really supporting patient convenience and addressing the most relevant and meaningful clinical outcomes as defined by patients themselves. And this is introducing even more around site enablement to sort of support the migration to personalized medicine and patient engagement. And the one other thing I'll just add here is that there's been this parallel shift in the role that data has played, an area that I know is so important to you. You know, back again, if you look at the late 80s and 90s, companies operated in such an insular way, and data was primarily reactive. We'd gather retrospective data to inform how we did, but it was difficult to apply it to future activity. And data was very, very siloed. And then in the later 90s and into the 2000s, data became more accessible. We were able to do more comparative analysis with the data, benchmarking, root cause analysis. And of late, it's become even more integrated, richer data that now is taking on even predictive qualities, and AI enablement will play an important role there as well. So what an exciting 35 years of incredibly dramatic change that we've been able to kind of monitor and characterize from my vantage point.
You started by saying 35 years ago, this industry was very traditional. Do you think that's changed, or do you think we are still incredibly traditional in our thinking and perhaps in our execution?
I see pockets of change that would suggest that we've made some progress, but there's so much more to be done. And I think, to your point, there are places where some of the more traditional practices, the risk aversion that really characterizes so many aspects of our philosophy and our culture, many of those still have yet to change. But there are areas where we do see attempts and intent to move away from a lot of the early practices that were so entrenched within a lot of our development activity.
Yeah, I think it's the conservatism, and let's be clear, we all understand where the conservatism is born from. This is literally a matter of life and death at times, so we fully appreciate that. But I also think the level of conservatism has gone further than probably most ever thought it would. And I do think we live in an era where we're starting to be more and more innovative. But maybe it's innovation baked on an old expectation of how trials were designed 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you think if you had the ability to completely redesign clinical trials today, do you think they would look anything like what we do today?
No, I don't. I think they'd be remarkably different, and they would draw more from some of the novel designs and executional models that are really only being piloted at this time. I want to come back, Richard, to your comment about conservatism. You know, if our phase transition probabilities and our overall success rates moved in the other direction, we might have been bolder. We would have been less conservative, but we've seen the opposite, right? As we've tried to push the envelope in select areas, we've also seen that our success rates now are the lowest they've ever been in our history. Our phase transition probabilities are worsening. So it's that risk aversion doesn't often find evidence to get us to move outside of our comfort zone, unless you're sort of a real innovator, typically in a more entrepreneurial setting. So there's a lot that works against our ability to move away from that risk averse or conservative mindset.
Yeah, I think there's a line you and I have discussed in the past. Maybe if our role is to succeed quickly but to fail early, that entrepreneurial underlying sensation should be there. And I think, as an industry, we have to be prepared to try things. And I don't mean taking undue risks. I don't want to put patient safety at any risk at any point. But I do think we can push the boundaries, maybe in parallel, on what AI can do, learn and confirm, as we've talked about in the past. I also think we put rules in our own way sometimes to do with where you can use and can't use certain technologies based on geographical boundaries, local regulations that perhaps could be harmonized and globalized to simplify a global regulatory landscape. And I think there's many things we could do there. And I think technology is starting to lead. But I think as an industry, we have a huge opportunity to embrace and move beyond.
I agree completely. And I think some of it, though, also relates to uh, changes in the structure of the landscape and where the technologies and solutions might ultimately come from. Just as an example, there's a growing belief that the investigative site may be the best source for an innovative technology instead of requiring, on the part of a sponsor or CRO, requiring the site to utilize a technology that's been offered. You know, we have this historical pathway where everything begins with the sponsor company and sort of flows downstream. And we've learned time and again that that may not be the ideal way that a partnership can be structured, and where you can find, where you can drive better efficiency and automation.
Oh, I completely agree. I think, look, where is research really happening? I think you said this earlier on, it's happening at sites. That's where you see patients. That's where research really is localized. And I think as part of that, I believe sites have already solved some problems locally. You know, I think telemedicine, for example, sites already have a solution. Why would you try and impose something else upon them? Let them use it. Maybe data collection, data management are in different groups. Centralized data management, you may, and I think, do need to centralize, and we'll come on to data management in a second, but how you gather things can be, I think, driven locally. And that is, I think, a key part of a really successful end-to-end clinical trial process. Let things happen in a natural way.
Yeah, and there are many analogies that can be drawn with other earlier practices. You know, sites at one time were really beginning to make inroads with recruitment and retention effectiveness practices, but often that went against what was recommended or supported by sponsors or CROs. So most sites sort of recognize that they kind of have to be a good citizen and sort of support the protocol in the way that the sponsor or CRO was most willing to accommodate.
How do you think, how would you categorize the change in data management over the years? And you and I have worked on some surveys that go lead into that, but how do you think the focus on data and data management has changed over the 35 years you've been researching?
Yeah, so I sort of alluded to that. There's sort of the nature of data moving from being that sort of siloed, lagging indicator to becoming a more strategic asset over time, right? There's sort of that element. And now, even with the promise of artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's sort of no bounds around the volume of data that we could technically be working with and the rigor of the analysis that could be performed. So there's the whole growth of even the data sciences movement is part of that. There's the whole change in the technologies and the solutions that have supported data management, moving from sort of very, very labor intensive, you know, paper-based and analog data to centralized EDC and technologies that better track and monitor and route data and capture and store data. Now, I think what we're seeing, and you live and breathe this, I know, is really more around the compatibility and the interoperability of data, integration, the centralized and synchronized way that data can be sort of harmonized and then accessed and used. So it has more of a cloud-based and an open environment where we can leverage talent. All this is all very, very exciting, but so much of it is aspirational as well, right? We see the day-to-day struggles of organizations that still have very, very siloed data sets that are not really compatible, that are really hard to integrate. So there's just so much room for growth and improvement as well.
Oh, definitely. I think you say a lot there in terms of data management as was versus as is. And I've said this time and time again, I think certain technological advances actually broke data management. And I'm going to put EDC front and center of that list because it led us to focus on one type of data. We then broke the process up, and the thing that was lost was the patient. And where are we now? We're desperately coming back to personalized medicine on the patient level. And so I don't want to dismiss the last 20 years. We've learned a huge amount, but it's interesting to come full circle. It's back to managing patients. And that's really, I think, critical where we need to be. I also think as part of that, you touched on going from kind of a centralized vision almost to decentralized. And I don't mean that in the sense of decentralized clinical trials, but just decentralizing data, as you mentioned, about let sites solve some of their own problems. But also then I think take it further to distribute it. It's having data available to everyone who needs it. So that collaboration, which was the second point you mentioned, that cross-industry collaboration can really start to take shape. What have you seen in that area? Maybe I can ask you to think about in terms of good examples of real collaboration that you think we need to do more of as an industry.
Oh my goodness, Richard, there are just so many places. There has been typically a very sort of insular, distrustful view of so many collaborators, right? We still take that approach often when you look at the relationship between the clinical team and outsourced service providers, for example. The site has often felt, as we've noted, has often felt that they're sort of on the tail end of so much work that's done that they come in as an afterthought. So that's clearly a place where we've typically seen the view has often been on whether the site is capable of executing the protocol as it's written and executing the trial with the solutions as we've required the site to use, but not really given. And the same with the CRO, using the sponsor's own operating practices and systems when the CROs and sites often can bring a better alternative to actually execute the trial. And then I think the partnership with patients and the public as well. We've done such a miserable job of really managing the public perception and understanding of the value and importance of clinical research. And that really ties in so directly with the work we do at CISCRP. Fundamentally, we believe that we've done a poor job in even establishing perceived value and understanding. And that alone is such an incredibly important area that we need to address to create a more effective collaboration in the future.
We do work in industry that, for whatever reason, does not hold the highest trust in the broader community. Do you think COVID and the pandemic temporarily or permanently changed that? And if it's temporary, why? And if it's permanent, why?
I think it has been only temporary, and most of the research I've seen would really suggest that as well. We did see dramatic growth in awareness of the importance of clinical research to support rapid vaccine development and treatment, COVID treatment development. But it takes so much more than a single event to create sort of lasting public and patient support. Part of the reason, Richard, is that we have nothing built into the system that creates sort of sustainable education that makes clinical research relevant frequently, right? It was a moment in time, but then we go back to our daily lives, we go back to thinking about our individual health journey, and rarely, if ever, do we even think about the role that clinical research may play in that process. So patients who were in clinical trials had even heightened sense of importance and meaning in what they were doing. And you may recall the number of research professionals who decided to volunteer for trials and suddenly got involved in a totally different way. It had such tremendous meaning for them. Very few people sort of see that meaning translate into something sustainable over time.
Yeah, I'd say a number of people I know both at Veeva and outside were actually participating in trials, and it was very interesting talking to them after that experience about how they went back to work and realized what we do isn't actually great for a lot of participants. We may have thought we were doing some great things, but actually it left a lot to be held. And I think
Yeah.
if you look at patient-reported outcomes as the number one area, we really started to think about our strategies of bring your own device versus supply versus all those other things. Really started to change the way we think.
That really goes back to a point that you made. It's something we often forget. Certainly, when you take a big step back and you look at the clinical research enterprise at that macro level, you sometimes lose sight of the fact that it's a very human activity and it's fraught with just a remarkable number of inefficiencies, dysfunction, mistakes that are made. That's sort of fundamentally the kind of messy part of our industry. It's when you take a step back at that level, it almost feels like a miracle that we get a single drug through the clinical research cycle and into the marketplace. And for a lot of patients who know nothing about clinical research until literally they're thrust into it, right? They've suddenly been diagnosed with an illness, or they've been on a therapy that isn't working and they're really desperate to find a new treatment or find a new option. It's only at that moment when they're sort of thrust into this strange world where there's a lot of human interactions and a lot going on behind the scenes that isn't explained well to them. So it is truly remarkable and also understandable why we can have a very profound experience in research, but most people also recognize that it's not all smooth sailing.
Maybe a word or two then on CISCRP from that. Where do you hope CISCRP can take research? What are the major things that you aspire to drive as an industry that needs to change?
Yeah, CISCRP has such a wonderful mission and it's really grown dramatically. I'm really proud to say it's now well above 60 full-time people who focus on a couple of core areas. There's all of the public and patient education, and it's education that's custom tailored to different communities, including underserved and marginalized communities, communities that are in rural and remote areas, as well as in some of the more urban areas and parts of the world. So there's the broad education. Then there's also the data that we gather to inform the research community on how to better engage with patients as partners in the process. So we do that Perceptions and Insights global study every 2 years, gets a lot of visibility today. We are doing now a lot of these patient advisory boards where patients are responding to a draft protocol and providing feedback to sponsors and CROs. So some of the work we do result in services to help industry better engage with patients. Those advisory boards are part of it. And we also do a lot of work, Richard, translating technical information into plain language information, trial results, informed consent, even peer review scientific journal articles. We're translating that into plain language and getting it back out to patients in those studies.
And do you think, this is perhaps an unfair question, but do you think as an industry we're listening enough to patients, or do you think we have a way to go on that?
I think we have a way to go. I think everybody is very, very well intentioned, right? You'd be really hard pressed today to find a single person in the research enterprise who doesn't believe that patient-centric practices and patient engagement isn't important. right? Professionals who all generally believe in its importance, patient engagement importance. But it's really in the execution and where we invest, where we support, where we're really falling down and falling down significantly. A lot of the patient engagement functions that were once centralized and had more influence in their organizations, they're now decentralized. Often they're part of a patient recruitment team focusing on very sort of short-term goals. Even professionals who've really been entrusted with creating more of a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion among our patient populations, even they are finding it really frustrating and difficult to translate important concepts into routine practice today. So we just have a really far distance to travel in order to make so many of these practices that we know are the right thing to do into a standard practice in our companies.
As an industry, we talk a lot about patient centricity. We talk a lot about site centricity. That word centricity, do you think it's a word we all have the same understanding of? Or do you think there's different pockets that react to a higher or lesser degree than as an industry we need to?
It's like everything else, Richard. It's sad that we choose a word early in an innovation or a movement, and then we realize when it's too late that the word doesn't really work. Like calling them decentralized clinical trial solutions, that alone is a misnomer, right? It still puts the site at the center of the execution of the trial, and now we're just moving away from the site. Patient-centric practices, I understand why the word was chosen, but that's why when I speak about it, I tend to favor words like patient involvement or patient engagement, because in some cases, yes, the patient is at the heart of everything we do, but the patient is engaged as a partner in the process, and therefore, we really have to find practices that really are the most relevant to patients, but also ensure that we're doing good science and we're executing it with the highest standards of quality and efficiency.
For anyone who's watched my previous episodes will think I paid you to be anti-decentralized, but I promise you, to anyone who's listening, I haven't. But we are absolutely on the same page. I think sometimes words matter, and this is one where it matters, and it set us off on a wrong path. But that is definitely a subject for another day, because I have still a lot I want to ask you. But if we could shift our attention just a little bit from CISCRP to others, that you have authored, along with your team, a huge number of research projects. If I could ask you to pick on a small number of them, what do you think some of the big messages have been? What do you think some of the most powerful, most well-received, or perhaps poorly received, depending on your perspective? But what do you think has shaped our industry the most in terms of some of those research projects?
It is so hard for me to pick and choose. In total, my team and I have put out some 300 plus studies that have resulted in peer review articles, another 400 to 500 that are in trade journals like Applied Clinical Trials and others. So it's always very hard to pick and choose. There are some that seem to resonate the most, like the work that we've done on protocol complexity. We're now looking at over 25 years of research, and the industry never tires of the work we do there and the updates we provide. I would say sort of a follow-up to that was our work on protocol amendments. And our work on amendments and the benchmarks that we provided and updated really have resonated very strongly. There are times when I'll give a talk and someone will rush the stage with a dog-eared copy of one of our papers on protocol amendments, and they'll ask me to sign it even. That's sort of the level of how much it resonates with people who've lived and breathed and applied a lot of that research. I think that a lot of the work that we've done that relates to patient recruitment and retention is often cited as well. And within it are concepts that relate to ways that we can better engage with patients. So I'm very proud of the work we've done on the referral behaviors of healthcare providers and how we can engage them as facilitators of partnership with our patients, for example. The work we're doing in terms of diversity and inclusion, we've done studies where we quantified disparities in our clinical trials by race and ethnicity. And anytime we're able to quantify something that everybody's talking about, I always feel that gets a lot of attention. And so we're happy about that. We did a study recently, Richard, which only confirmed what everyone has known for a long time, but we confirmed it quantitatively, empirically. We showed that the race and ethnicity of investigative site personnel is correlated with and predictive of the race and ethnicity of the patients that we enroll in our studies. Not rocket science, right? But profound empirical evidence that many said to us has confirmed what I've known all along. So I think a lot of our studies basically do that.
The thing I like about a lot of your research projects is it isn't just a binary answer, the yes, no, the number. It's also the fact that you've alluded to what's hidden within it. And I think about amendments. It wasn't just the number of amendments, but actually what people now do is they roll together until they have enough amendments to make an amendment, if that makes sense. And you think, but if the science is paramount to the success of a study, you're running a suboptimal study for a period of time until you think, oh, now I've got, I think it was 7.2 amendments on average, I'll make a protocol amendment. It's not the way to run an industry. It's not the way to run a clinical trial. So I think it's always, for me, a lot of the values, not just been the result, it's been what it inferred we were doing and the research into what we're doing in this industry that I think leads to significant change.
I really appreciate that you notice that, and it's probably something that we most enjoy. That's the most rewarding, is when, once again, when you look at the data, it's never a simple answer, right? But instead, it has many factors and comes down to a set of informed decisions that have to be made and trade-offs that have to be agreed upon. I know you and I have talked about this in the past, knowing that if you amend a protocol, it's going to result in the following downstream effect, and it's going to cost X amount, should be considered before the decision is made. Knowing that certain protocol design elements will have an impact on your dropout rates and your enrollment timelines, it's really that those are sort of important insights that we really hope will inform better decision making.
You've done a huge amount. You've shaped so much for industry. What keeps you motivated to keep trying to transform our industry?
It's a great question, and I'm often introduced when I give a talk by with the comment, "I really feel sorry for this guy. He's like a broken record. You know, he's always sort of painting a picture that only depresses us more." And yet, I could be farthest from what that implies in terms of my mindset. I'm just having so much fun, Richard. I really love what I do, and I feel that it's an important role to be a kind of an educator, to be providing evidence and data that can inform others, and that if it has the ability to help us think even more smartly and clearly about the meaningful work that we do as an enterprise in delivering better healthcare to the patient community and to the public, then I'm super motivated. And people often ask me, how do you come up with the next study? And the The quick answer is we can't keep up with the number of new ideas of areas to research, some that are brought to us by people like you who reach out and say, this is an area that we think is really important. Have you thought about doing a study in this area? There's just no shortage. And usually by the time we get around to it, it's time to update some of our studies where we're monitoring comprehensive trends and changes. So there's just so much to do as well. I'm super motivated and enthusiastic about our project work.
So, motivated by work, but many of us know you through the work, but what about personal life, if I can ask that? So, as we discussed just recently, you to being a grandfather, how's that role shaping your thinking of an industry and society and everything else in between?
It's certainly, I've been so privileged being in an academic environment and in the nonprofit world. There was a period in my life very early on. I started in management consulting and was working very, very long hours. At the time, most management consultants worked on site. So I was traveling to parts of the world and working on site. When CenterWatch was created and for its first 10 years, it was really, I was really burning the candle on both ends. But when I moved into academia, it suddenly gave me much greater life balance. And so I'm really happy to say that it's all part of one whole. I'm never not thinking about the work that I do, and I'm also never not thinking about my life balance and the things that are meaningful to me outside of the work I do within the clinical research space. So I'm just happy to say that I really am lucky that I have that kind of balance, and it's probably kept me feeling younger and more energized, and I'm just lucky that I fell into that.
You'll sometimes make your own luck, and I think you've definitely made your own luck, which is a huge compliment to you. Now, because of time, I had two questions I'm going to try and merge. I'd love to know a little about how you think we should look to the future to transform the industry, but I always have a last question I like to ask people, and that is to put you in the wonderful position, if you had a magic wand, and if you could use that magic wand to create something, to do something tomorrow that you can't do today, I'd like to know what it is, but also the reverse question. If you could wave that magic wand and make something disappear, assign it to room 101 so it never had to be thought of ever again, what would that be?
Yeah, these are always so hard, right? A lot of it depends on where you are at the moment, what's requiring a lot of your attention. We alluded to one of them. If I had a magic wand, I would love to figure out sooner rather than later how to remove the separation between clinical care and clinical research, and to really force these two sort of parallel but separate environments to actually start to enable each other. There's a vision for this, the learning health model, but and you and I touched on this as well. There's just so much infrastructure and data and personnel within the clinical care environment who could play such a critical role partnering with the clinical research community to better leverage and harness the great work that we're trying to do to really meet unmet medical needs and serve the patient community. So that's one, if I had a magic wand. The other sort of is a little bit of a tie-in to that, and it's part of the CISCRP mission, which is to get clinical research to become more of a mainstream part of our mindset as a society. There was a wonderful paper written in JAMA many years ago, over 20 years ago, that sort of talked about changing our view of clinical research. So not viewing it as an alternative for the most desperately ill, but something that society has an obligation to support because it ultimately elevates public health in general. And so that ties in with all of the education, our ability to engage the health professional community and other critical influencers. Those would be two areas that I think could play a huge part in helping our enterprise, especially as we move into even more customized and risky and smaller target market clinical research activity. Things to get rid of, oh my goodness, Richard, it's much more than two. That's for sure. But if I had to summarize, I would say one is that there are just so many labor intensive, highly inefficient practices that we can't seem to get away from, like 100% source data verification, right? Or the oversight, redundant oversight that we bring to many of our projects where we have contracted providers. There's this inherent lack of trust in a lot of those relationships that creates all kinds of redundancy and inefficiency. I'd love to get rid of that. And you could probably go through so many different areas of practice and identify those redundancies right away. And then the last area would be the one that you and I really touched on, which is if we could truly change the culture of our organizations to strike a better balance between embracing an innovation and our aversion to risk or our conservative practices. You know, if we could sort of move away from that ultra conservative mindset and the influence that often functions within our companies have, like regulatory affairs and legal, can often really put a kibosh on innovative practice that could really, if it were fully invested in and embraced, could have a huge impact on improving speed and efficiency and quality.
Well, I think you could not have epitomized Room 101 much better there, because I think about where Room 101 was born, and the Big Brother syndrome, and Big Brother is watching. Think about how the ineffectiveness of that to remove conservatism, redundancies, and a lack of trust seems a perfect way for us to conclude this podcast. We're definitely going to have to bring you back and talk about all the other projects you've done. But from my perspective, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, as always, talking to you, and I look forward to connecting in the very near future to talk about our next research project, whatever that might be. But before I wrap up for the purpose of the editorial, maybe I can give you the last word for our audience today.
Well, my closing thoughts would be one, thank you, Richard, for the chance to reflect a bit and to take a step back and to thank your audience as well for the privilege that I've had in being able to sit where I sit and to gather this data and to be an educator and to have the privilege of providing insights that inform this noble industry that we're all so passionate about. So a big thank you to everybody for that wonderful opportunity.
Thank you for that, and thank you for joining us. A note for those of you listening, if you've enjoyed this episode of the State of Digital Clinical Trials, please do go ahead to wherever you download your podcasts. Please go ahead and consider listening to the other episodes. I'm really delighted to say that, Ken, you are wrapping up Series 2 for me. Rest of my audience, if you would like to be a guest in Series 3, please do go ahead and contact either myself direct, or feel free to use the email address, which is sdctpod, so sdctpod@veeva.com. I'm assured that will be appearing on the screen now for you to see as well.